DFS.
It is Friday, December 3rd here in Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York. Welcome to our Week 13 DraftKings podcast. I'm your host, Matt Schaff. With me, as always, is Jared Smola. And this podcast is sponsored by our partners at Fanshare Sports. Fanshare curates hundreds of pieces of daily fantasy sports-related articles, tweets, and podcasts to create the most accurate ownership projections in the industry. Those projections can be found in the lineup generator on DraftSharks.com, and you can find up-to-date ownership info anytime at fansharesports.com. Jared, we're doing this show earlier than usual. It's noon Eastern time right now. We've been doing this at night most weeks this season, so we don't have final answers on a lot of injury situations yet. And then we don't even have like the afternoon answers, the pre-answer answers on a lot of these injury situations. It's going to affect some things this week. So, if you're listening to this show later on, know that you can find up-to-date injury info on draftsharks.com. And we are adjusting our planning with those things in mind. But for now, we'll kind of address what we can, right?
Yeah, projections will be updated. Obviously, they'll update in the lineup generator so you can see, the updated best values per position. I think the two big injury questions are both on the Rams, right? Odell Beckham and Darrell Henderson. Henderson especially, I think. Sony Michel becomes a must-play in cash and probably a 100% guy for me even in tournaments if Henderson is ruled out.
Yeah, he's going to be tough to pass on if there's no Darrell Henderson this week, but we'll see how that develops. So with all that in mind, let's go about our usual rundown, and we'll start at quarterback for cash. And Jared, I know on DraftKings, we love cheap quarterbacks here. Does 4K Mike Glennon fit?
You can mess around with it. I mean, there are plenty of pay up options, or you could probably, get a few of those guys if you do play Mike Glennon. If I'm going the cheap route, I'd rather get up to the other side of that game and to a Tagovailoa at $5,500. He's just been good for a while now, really since coming back from that initial injury. He has 16 plus DK points in 4 of his last 6 games. He's averaging 19 DraftKings points over that span. He's 8th in PFF passing grade over those last 6 games. The Giants' pass defense has been pretty solid this season, looking at Football Outsider stuff or adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. But teams are passing against the Giants at the 5th highest rate in the NFL in neutral situations. Miami's been a pass-leaning offense this season anyways. So I think you're going to get plenty of volume from Tua in this game. He might get Devontae Parker back too on Sunday, which would help.
It is worth noting. I think Tua's fine down at that price. I think it's worth noting the Giants pass offense by DVOA has been awesome over the past 5 games. They're up to 11th in overall defensive DVOA and 9th in weighted DVOA, which looks more at more recent games. So, I mean, there's a chance that you get a low scoring game and not a lot of fantasy points from Tua, willing to take that risk at 5,500 in a cash lineup. I feel a little bit better about 6K Derek Carr against Washington this week, especially if Darren Waller's out. I mean, if Darren Waller's there, it helps Derek Carr in general, but if Darren Waller's out, then I have $2,700 Foster Moreau to stack with him in that lineup and offer a bit more salary savings. Washington's defense has been better overall after a terrible start to the season, but the DVOA on Football Outsiders says it's only had 2 positive performances in pass defense the entire season. Much tougher against the run than the pass. So I'm really not worried about the matchup for Derek Carr here. His performance has been down since Henry Ruggs' demise, but Carr has still reached 19 DK points in 2 of the past 4 games. Both of those came within the past 3 weeks. He had 24 last week against Dallas and has had the long layoff since then, will have had that by the time Sunday rolls around. For the season, Derek Carr is 8th among main slate QBs and DK points per game, 11th in salary, so a little bit of value there. And even the 3 guys just ahead of him in that salary list this week, Carson Wentz, Joe Burrow, Russell Wilson, all look shakier to me as fantasy bets than Derek Carr does this week.
That Vegas-Washington game has a surprisingly high over-under. I think it's like 50 or 50.5 points. I would bet the under, but if you believe in Vegas, I think that's a sneaky game to look to. I also think paying up in cash is viable this week, and my pay-up guy would be Tom Brady, $7,200. I mean, he gets Atlanta. He had 5 touchdowns against the Falcons in their first meeting. We saw all the touchdowns go to Leonard Fournette last week. I kind of think that swings back, and Brady gets 3 or 4 in this game.
I think all of them go to Leonard Fournette once again. It's just the beginning of a trend here. I agree. I could see the Raiders Washington game disappointing with points. It's a solid number to begin with. I think it would be less of a focus for GPP. I'm less interested in Derek Carr there, though he is in play. I'm also interested on the GPP side, though, in Tyrod Taylor in that cheap range at $5,300. The Colts' two best defensive players are managing injuries. Darius Leonard has been all season, had an ankle issue, might be healthier now than he's been in a while, but still been managing it all season. And then DeForest Buckner is the big question for them this week. Did return to limited practice Thursday, so he might be ready to play through the knee injury that he played through last week, but he's probably not going to be full strength DeForest Buckner. And that could be a particularly key injury for Tyrod Taylor, who, likes to throw deep, likes to run the ball. Obviously, a no DeForest Buckner or a limited DeForest Buckner would help in both of those areas.
Yeah, I think the nice thing about Taylor, easy stack, obviously, with Brandon Cooks, and I think Tyrod's cheap enough where it helps you fit Jonathan Taylor in your lineup as the run back on the other side of that game. So I like that call. I have a bunch of guys I'm interested in tournaments this week. It's going to be a week where I'm going to have to pare down. I think Lamar Jackson is interesting, coming off 2 duds now. He's $7,800. I think he's going to come in super low owned. We'll see what FanShare says. He had 35.6 DK points 3 games ago. He has other games of 37 and 46 DK points this season. So the ceiling is obviously there. Steelers down to 26th in Football Outsiders pass defense DVOA. They're 24th in Football Outsiders run defense DVOA. They're probably going to be without TJ Watt and Joe Hayden in this game. So I think it's a potential bounce back spot for Lamar Jackson. I like stacking him with Marquis Brown. Matt Stafford, someone I'm interested in, especially if Darrell Henderson's out. That'd be the one case where I don't play Sony Michel, is fade Michel and play the passing side of that Rams offense. We'll see if Odell Beckham is in there. If he's not, I think it makes Stafford easier to stack with probably Cooper Kupp and Van Jefferson. You can maybe throw in the tight end that I won't name in that stack if you want. Two more guys I have. Joe Burrow. So last week, Leonard Fournette was the tournament winning play, and I think it was super sharp. Everyone was on the Bucs passing game. It was obviously a better matchup for the Bucs passing game. You play Leonard Fournette at like 1% ownership. All the touchdowns go to him, and you win tournaments. I kind of think it's the same case with Burrow this week. Flipped though, where everyone's going to be playing Joe Mixon against this Chargers defense that we know is much weaker against the run than the pass. But Mixon can have a big game, and the touchdowns just happen to go to Joe Burrow in the passing game. And there is some positive regression coming for Burrow. Over the last 3 weeks, Joe Mixon has 6 rushing touchdowns. Joe Burrow has just 2 passing touchdowns. So, 75% of their scores have come via the ground. League-wide average is like 2/3 of passing touchdowns come via the passing game. So there's some flippening that's going to happen there. I'm going to take a shot on Burrow this week. And then my last guy, super gross, can't believe I didn't think I'd ever be mentioning his name this season, but Ben Roethlisberger, he's $5,000. This Ravens defense is a pass funnel to begin with. They're 5th in Football Outsiders run D. They're 24th in pass D. They're dealing with a bunch of cornerback injuries. We'll see if any of the guys actually missed the game. There's been a couple of guys that have been missing practice with illness. So we'll see who's available for Baltimore. But for $5,000, if you can get 18 points out of Big Ben, what he lets you do at other positions might be enough to take down a tournament.
Yeah, don't worry about that strained move. Go ahead and play him at 5K and see what you can get from there. Yeah. I'm probably going to focus primarily, if I'm on the higher end, with Tom Brady, Kirk Cousins, Matthew Stafford. But I can't argue with getting some shares of those other guys. I think it's also possible to run naked Tyrod this week, although that sounds like a game that your wife would tell you to stop playing at home. Brandon Cooks is obviously the number 1 receiver, but it's possible that Tyrod just does his stuff without targeting his wide receiver a whole bunch in this game. So plenty of options to play around with. And I think as we move on to running back, even more attractive options at this position. It struck me as an especially attractive week at running back. And, I think that we started the week with Alexander Mattison as a focal point, and it's understandable. Even though he has been priced up to some degree, he's still a good value. You can see it in our lineup generator. But there are lots of other guys. Like, you don't have to play Alexander Mattison this week.
You don't have to play Jonathan Taylor either, which is scary. Like, it'd be scary making a cash on it without JT, but Taylor only comes in as our 7th best dollars per point value at running back. Alexander Mattison, who I think is as good, if not the best touch bet on the week at running back. And he only comes in as our 5th best dollars per point value. So, paying down, there's some cheaper guys here. James Conner, to me, $5,900, 26, 14, and 27 opportunities in 3 games without Chase Edmonds, including the game Edmonds left on his first snap. And that came, with Colt McCoy under center. Now he gets Kyler Murray back likely. We'll see, but it sounds like Kyler's going to be back. So that just boosts the entire offense. So I think Connor is a great touch bet. Antonio Gibson, too, at $5,700. We're assuming J.D. McKissick is going to be out with his concussion. So Gibson has already been dominating carries, especially since the bye week, and he should do most of the passing game stuff as well without McKissick, and has a good matchup against the Raiders.
Yeah, I mean, Jamal Williams at 5,400 is in play. Elijah Mitchell at 6K is in play. You could take three of those guys and not play either Mattison or Jonathan Taylor. I'm not sure I'll actually do that in cash. I think I would probably like to have, I don't know, somebody that's a bit better scoring bet, but I can't even say that Mattison and Jonathan Taylor are definitely better scoring bets than that group relative to what you're paying to have them on your roster. All those guys should be headed for workhorse roles in favorable spots. Obviously, Jamaal Williams is in the weakest offense there and, probably has the most negative matchup, but he also could see 10 targets in that game just by way of what Detroit has done offensively this year.
Definitely.
On the GPP side, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, as we've said, there's enough good running back plays, and I don't want to stray too far from the, those 4 or 5 guys we just mentioned. 2 other guys I'm going to consider. Myles Gaskin at $5,800. His DraftKings price isn't moving. It's been in the mid to high 5,000s for a while now, despite the fact that he's really been a workhorse for the past 4 weeks. He's second among all running backs in carries over the last 4 weeks. He's 16th in targets. He's 11th in PPR points over that span. Gets a good matchup here against the Giants, who, as we mentioned, have been pretty tough against the pass. They're still 31st in Football Outsiders run D, 28th in adjusted points allowed to running back. So good spot for Gaskin. The other guy I'm going to go back to is Miles Sanders, who was popular last week at $5,100 in a good matchup. Now he's $5,200 in really an even better matchup against the Jets, who are dead last in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. Miles Sanders put in a full practice on Thursday. So, maybe you still avoid him in cash for that reason. Not that I'd consider him in cash anyways with all the other options, but maybe the ankle adds some risk still. But the fact that he was a full go on Thursday tells me we shouldn't be too worried about it. Jordan Howard's not going to play in this game. Boston Scott has not practiced the first 2 days of the week because of an illness. That rarely keeps guys out, but maybe it impacts his workload on Sunday. So I think Sanders is a good touch bet in a good run heavy Eagles offense in a great matchup.
It's going to be no on Miles Sanders for me this week. There's too much work splitting there and too many other guys available.
Everyone's going to say no too. That's why he's going to be like 3%. So
you can have him at 3%. I'll play these other guys no matter what their ownership rates are. I wonder what Leonard Fournette's going to come in at 7,300. We tend to assume that a guy who's not overpriced coming off a week like he just had will see huge ownership this week, but that just doesn't happen anymore. Like, for example, Jalen Hurts last week was coming off the 3 touchdown performance and then still carried a single digit ownership number in a positive matchup for rushing against the Giants. So that suckered me into Jalen Hurts and got me burned in tournaments last week. But it was similar with Jonathan Taylor the week before. He had the enormous game against the Bills. And then the next week, his ownership rate was up higher, but it was at like 13%, I think was the projection there. So not as high as you would normally see for a workhorse back coming off a monster game. So I think that a sharp field can keep Leonard Fournette from being too highly owned this week, which then makes him more attractive, I think, because that $7,300 salary just kind of sneaks in there. It's right behind Alexander Mattison. Joe Mixon is not too far ahead of that at 8,100. So I think we could get Fournette this week at a lower rate than he should be based on his situation and what he's getting work-wise now. And Joe Mixon at 8,100. I mean, he's going to be highly owned this week, but he's worth mixing in if you're doing a bunch of lineups here. Faces the league's softest run defense. The offense has leaned back toward the run with its situation neutral tendencies since the bye a couple weeks ago. So, I mean, toss those guys into that pool of running backs that we already mentioned. I'm sticking with that group of running backs and just kind of mixing and matching for my different lineups here rather than reaching for somebody that I keep lighting candles for down at the church, like Miles Sanders.
Yeah, I'm super interested to see the ownership projection on Leonard Fournette. Sometimes nowadays I feel like a guy coming off a big game makes him lower owned than he might be otherwise, because people are like, he can't do that again. He's going to be high owned because of that. And then people just hop off him. Plus, people are going to want to play the Bucs passing game, which is going to keep people off Fournette. So I don't think he's going to be chalky. And if he's, in the single digits, I'll definitely be interested in Fournette in tournaments.
Mm-hmm. Wide receiver for cash. For me, Jared, Brandon Ayuk doesn't sit atop our DK dollars per point rankings, but at 5,600, he feels safer to me than the other 5K guys that are ahead of him in those rankings. I mean, Odell Beckham, for example, has the injury, which keeps me from considering him for cash, even if he's ready to go for this game. Michael Pittman has a low volume floor, just like Ayuk here for his offense overall. Similar option, so I wouldn't argue if somebody likes Pittman better than Ayuk, but I like Ayuk's price versus George Kittle, who's $300 more, and that salary is tougher to make up at tight end than it is at wide receiver, I think, or tougher to make up at wide receiver, I guess I should say, than it is at tight end. Darnell Mooney, I think, comes off as a similar option to Ayuk at a similar price, but the key difference between those two is Darnell Mooney is facing Arizona, which is third in pass defense DVOA. Ayuk gets Seattle, which is 27th in that category.
Yeah, plus Darnell Mooney's on the Bears, which you never feel super comfortable playing any Bear in cash. I do like Ayuk best among the 5K wide receivers. Although if Odell Beckham is out, and I think Van Jefferson becomes super interesting, he's at $5,300. So we'll see about OBJ. I think you can live in the 6,000s this week if you don't play Jonathan Taylor. Deontay Johnson is $6,800. He has 13 plus targets in 3 straight games. In 5 of his last 6 games. For the entire season, he has double-digit targets in 8 of 10 games overall. I talked about the Ravens secondary being banged up. It's a pass funnel defense anyway. So, Deontay is as good a target bet as anyone on this slate. And I'm going to go back to Chris Godwin, too. Obviously coming off the dud last week, his price is down $400 to $6,600. Before last week, he had averaged 9.3 targets in the previous 4 games without Antonio Brown. Has a good matchup here against Atlanta. Godwin went for 4 catches, 62 yards, and a touchdown against Atlanta back in week 2, and that was with Antonio Brown. So I think he's still too cheap for the volume in the matchup here.
And he did that on only 5 targets in a game where Tom Brady just spread it around. I think Mike Evans was the only guy that had more than 5 targets in that game. So yeah, I like those guys. And I think that it's easier this week than it is most to fit 3 receivers from that 5K to 6K range. I feel better about leaving Jonathan Taylor out and playing those more affordable running backs than I do in reaching for one of the lower priced wide receivers this week to, allow the opposite to happen.
Me too. Totally. And then, if JT is going to put up 30 and I'm going to lose.
Right. On the GPP side since you mentioned that, I think normally that would be a greater concern. Obviously it's a concern, but I think all those guys that we talked about, James Conner, Elijah Mitchell, they're, similarly good bets to get 20 to 25 carries this week and have shots to find the end zone twice.
They are. They totally are. But I'm just saying if one of them busts and JT puts up 30, it's going to be trouble.
Sure. All right. So now on to GPP at wideout. The question with Beckham and Van Jefferson, I think both guys are more attractive here for the ceiling potential, especially if Beckham is active for this game. I think Van Jefferson's ownership rate is going to spike if Beckham's out, because we did see Jefferson run very close, near identical to Beckham last week.
Yeah, just a super concentrated offense there, with Cup, Beckham, and Jefferson now. So if Beckham's out, it just becomes even more concentrated. So I think Jefferson would be a good play in cash and tournament still. I have 2 guys here that kind of go with some of my more contrarian quarterbacks. Jamar Chase as a stack with Joe Burrow. So, Chase is down to $7,000. It's his cheapest price since week 7. And that's really because he's sucked from a box score perspective over the last 4 games now. His efficiency has just tanked after being super efficient for those first 7 games. He has a 48% catch rate over his last 4, 10.1 yards per catch. His touchdown rate is down, but he's actually averaging half a target more per game over the last 4 games than he was over the first 7, 7.8 targets per game in the last 4, first 7.3 over the first 7. His target share is basically identical. So basically his usage has been the same. He's just, been running cold efficiency wise. So he's a guy at this point I'm going to keep playing until we get that next big game. I think it's coming. The matchup isn't ideal this week, so maybe it doesn't come this week, but I'm assuming he's going to be, like 5% owned. So I'm going to take a shot on Jamar Chase. My other guy is Chase Claypool as a stack with Ben Roethlisberger. So Claypool has 9 and 8 targets in his 2 games back from that toe injury. He's 4th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points over the last 2 weeks. So he's been getting awesome usage. And again, I kind of sort of like this spot for the Steelers passing game. If, Big Ben just can be something less than a disaster. I think Claypool could deliver at a pretty nice price tag, $6,000.
Mm-hmm. And it's even possible for him to be a disaster and still hit Claypool for the one big play that makes it at least a decent game.
Yep.
I talked about not liking the cheap wideouts. I think if we get Devontae Parker back this week, and it seems like it's trending that way, but we'll have to watch to make sure it happens. He could be a difference maker at $3,900. I mentioned the Giants playing well in pass defense lately, and that's certainly true, but that's why a $3,900 Parker is the kind of bet I want to make in that, because if it doesn't work out, I can still be okay even without him putting up big numbers. He has been good this year when on the field, though. Last time we saw him, 11 targets, 8 catches for 85 yards against the Bills, no fewer than 7 targets in any of his 5 games this season for Parker. So, again, watch to make sure he's active, but if he's out there, he should get targeted and should be a decent bet for upside.
Yeah, definitely. I would resist any temptation to use him in cash coming off the hamstring, but $3,900 for a talented receiver who could get 8 to 10 targets is a pretty nice tournament play.
Mm-hmm. Over at tight end for cash, Fabian Moreau is kind of tough to get. Not Foster Moreau. Fabian Moreau is a cornerback. Foster Moreau is tough to get away from unless you are an IDP guy who also talks about Fabian Moreau at times.
Yes, I don't see any reason to play anyone other than Foster Moreau in cash at $2,700. He had 6 catches, 60 yards, and a touchdown in that game Waller missed back in week 7. I think more importantly, the usage is kind of what we want to see. 86% route rate, 6 targets. That was an 18% target share. He's getting top 12 tight end usage without Waller for $2,700. Matchup's pretty good too. Washington 18th in adjusted points allowed to tight ends.
Yeah, he's less than half of the salary of Darren Waller, so he can be less than half of Darren Waller and still be okay for what we're paying for. I think we all expect him to be more than, half of Darren Waller. Washington, 12th in tight end coverage DVOA, so not a pushover at that position, but also not a dangerous matchup there, and they're weaker against wide receivers, so it'd be nice to capitalize on that, but Hunter Renfro's a little too expensive to be all that attractive on DK right now.
Agreed.
On the GPP side, we'll see about Moreau's ownership. I think it's going to be pretty high if we don't have any Darren Waller this week. So I'm ready to pivot from him in a tourney lineup to $3,800 Gerald Everett. Obviously, it's a big leap to get up there, or $4,300 Pat Freiermuth. Both of those guys I just think are better bets to score than $2,600 James O'Shaughnessy. But should I be considering O'Shaughnessy more strongly here?
I'm not going to, he'd be a cheap cash play for me. It's just tough to see him hitting a ceiling. He could score a touchdown and then he hits ceiling at that price. I just don't think it's a great bet. And I'm obviously not playing O'Shaughnessy over Moreau and cash. So I'm not going to get to him. I do like the Pat Freiermuth call. I'm curious to see what his ownership ends up at. I think he might get popular. He's been scoring so many touchdowns lately. I think people know the Ravens are a good tight end matchup. I'm going to try to force myself to get up to George Kittle in tournaments, $5,900. I rarely get myself to pay up at tight end, even in tournaments, but I do think Kittle is a good price at $5,900. Even a good value for a flex spot if you want to use like Moreau at tight end and Kittle at flex at that price. Coming off a dud, obviously, but Kittle had 13.4, 16, and 24.1 DraftKings points in his previous 3 games, and Deebo Samuel likely out of this game frees up some more targets for Kittle, and the Seahawks are 29th in adjusted points allowed to tight ends.
Yeah, 4th most friendly scoring matchup for the position. So yeah, I like getting Kittle in here. And I agree that there's enough low priced and upside options at tight end to consider using 2 of these guys. And again, have to avoid that choice of selecting a low price wide receiver that we don't like. I want to throw out Logan Thomas before we finish at the position, $4,000. So even a little cheaper than Pat Freiermuth, $200 more than Gerald Everett, who I'll talk about more on the FanDuel show. But Logan Thomas played 79% of the snaps in his return last week, got 6 targets in that game against Seattle. Raiders are 29th in tight end coverage DVOA. We talked on a previous show about Jonathan Abrams' struggles in coverage this season. So it's an upside spot for Logan Thomas. Overall, the Raiders are the 6th most friendly matchup for tight end scoring by our adjusted fantasy points allowed. So good spot in an offense that doesn't have a whole lot of receiving options. Defense, Jared, I don't know about you, but I'm just going to be living in the $3,200 to $3,600 range. And I don't even know if I have a single favorite team in there.
Yeah, there's no good cheap plays this week, which I don't like for cash. It's funny, the Eagles at $3,600 pop as our top value, which is very rare. It's almost always a defense in the 2000s that come in as our top value because the position is so condensed. We have a big projection for the Eagles against the Jets. Zach Wilson has just been super giving to defenses. So it's worth at least seeing if you can get to the Eagles in cash. I think the Vikings for 3,200, so saving 400 from the Eagles, are a nice play too against the Lions. If you do have to go cheap, I would just go down to Washington as a price play, a salary saver. $2,500. One good thing I can say about Washington here is Vegas is a pass heavy offense. They're 6th in situation neutral pass rate, and teams have been going pass heavy against Washington, which makes sense because they are, much tougher against the run than the pass. So you should get a bunch of Derek Carr pass attempts, which always leads to, sack and interception potential.
Yeah. So other teams in that range, I agree with all of those. And I'm probably not going down to Washington, but if you need to, I think it's an option in that range that I mentioned, though. We got the Vikings 3,200, Dolphins against the Giants at 3,300, Cardinals against the Bears at 3,400, Bucks against the Falcons at 3,500, the Eagles, as you mentioned, at 36, and then the Colts even just above that at 37 against the Texans. If I get into that range and I don't need that extra $100, $200, then it's just going to be mixing among those because I think all of them carry plenty of upside. And when you're talking about defenses that are close, it's really just who happens to luck into a touchdown that makes them the good play for the week.
Yes, and I'm curious to see what ownership, how it shakes out here. It might end up being super spread and you don't have to worry about it. But if ownership does condense around a couple defenses, I'll just go to the defenses right above or below that. Just get the low owned.
Yeah, definitely a position where I'm more willing to let the ownership projections drive my decisions than at the skill positions.
Yep.
Well, that's going to do it for this Week 13 DraftKings podcast. Head over to draftsharks.com to get more player recommendations. If you're a DS Insider, you can check out Jared's cash game picks, as well as top GPP options from Corey Bushland. You can also mess around with the lineup generator to build your own lineups with the help of the DS projections and FanShare ownership projections. For more discussion of DFS and other formats, you can also join the free Draft Sharks Discord. You can find the link for that in the description for this podcast. If you're with us on the stream right now, stick around. We're going to take a brief break, and then we're going to fire up the FanDuel show. For Jared Small and the rest of the Draft Sharks crew, I'm Matt Schaff saying thanks so much for swimming with us. It is Friday, December 3rd here in Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York. Welcome to our Week 13 FanDuel podcast. I'm your host, Matt Schaff. With me, as always, is Jared Smola, and this podcast is sponsored by our partners at FanShare Sports. FanShare curates hundreds of pieces of daily fantasy sports-related articles, tweets, and podcasts to create the most accurate ownership projections in the industry. Those projections can be found in the lineup generator on DraftSharks.com, and you can find up-to-date ownership info anytime at FanshareSports.com. Jared, over on FanDuel here, what are you doing for a cash quarterback?
Yeah, as usual, I'm paying up for quarterback on FanDuel and cash. I'm going to go Tom Brady at $8,100. Comes in tied for our top dollars per point value at the position. Gets a Falcons defense that is 29th in Football Outsiders pass defense DVOA and 29th in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. Brady threw for 276 yards and 5 touchdowns in the Week 2 meeting against the Falcons this season. And last season, he put up 390 yards and 2 touchdowns and 399 yards and 4 touchdowns in 2 meetings against Atlanta. So, we'll take any of those lines.
Yeah, and plenty of options for stacking with him as well. I think Tom Brady obviously in play. Matthew Stafford's the other guy that I'm looking at here, $300 less than Tom Brady. As you mentioned, Atlanta's a good matchup for Brady, 4th most friendly QB scoring matchup by our adjusted fantasy points allowed. Jacksonville, probably not as good a scoring matchup for quarterbacks as you'd expect. They're just 20th in adjusted fantasy points allowed, that same category where I just said Atlanta's 4th. So a slightly negative matchup by those numbers, but I don't think that's because they're a legit defense. They're 32nd in pass defense DVOA, according to Football Outsiders. The Jags had a stellar performance against Buffalo a few weeks ago. They had a good one against Indy the next week. They were back to not good the past 2 weeks against San Francisco and Atlanta in pass defense. So I'm going to go ahead and bet on Stafford and his crew. Multiple stacking options for him as well. We'll wait and see on the Odell Beckham injury situation, but either way on that, there's Cooper Kupp available to stack with him. And there's enough at running back this week to make Cooper Kupp more of a cash consideration than he usually is for me.
Definitely. And Jacksonville actually is decent against the run. Football Outsiders has them 14th in run defense. So I like Stafford, especially in tournaments. and especially in tournaments if Darrell Henderson gets ruled out, because everyone's going to flock to Sony Michel in that case. And I think, that'll take some ownership away from Stafford and the Rams passing game.
Yeah, I like that as well. Anybody else you like among GPP quarterbacks?
Yeah, I'll mention Lamar Jackson again here. I mentioned him on the DraftKings show. It's even easier to fit him in on FanDuel here. He is $8,500 coming off 2 disappointing real life and fantasy games, which I think will suppress the ownership. But I mean, Jackson has games of 32.5, 34, and 42 FanDuel points this season. So obviously has the ceiling we're looking for. The Steelers defense just isn't very good against the pass or the run, which, is important for Lamar's fantasy projection. And Pittsburgh's probably going to be without TJ Watt. He might be without Joe Hayden. So it's a beatable defense that's going to be shorthanded on Sunday.
I definitely can't argue with mixing in Lamar Jackson. I can't say that I feel awesome about that being a high scoring game or the way he's played lately just from watching him. But I mean, capable of a rebound at any point. Yep. In a similar vein, I will go back to Jalen Hurts some this week because I don't imagine that his ownership level is going to be high. And he has delivered pretty much all season. Last week was the second time this year that he didn't finish among the top 12 fantasy QBs. And the other time was just because Jordan Howard and Boston Scott stole all the touchdowns from him. So we'll have to watch his injury status, but he's been saying all week that he's going to play. I would have to assume that he's at least good enough to beat a Jets team if he's good enough to play in this game that has allowed the most rushing touchdowns in the league. It arrives as a 6.5 point underdog. So, in a good position for the Eagles to keep running the ball and for Jalen Hurts to be heavily involved in that. Kirk Cousins is another one that I want to throw out at $7,700. He's been over 21 FanDuel points 6 times this season, 25 against Green Bay 2 weeks ago, 2+ touchdown passes in 4 straight games now for Kirk Cousins. He's fallen short of 32 pass attempts only once all year. So we always kind of worry about the volume question for him, but a decent volume bet in a matchup that should be good for everything on the Minnesota offense. Yes. Detroit has allowed the 5th most FanDuel points per game to quarterbacks on the season. And, I think Alexander Mattison is just going to draw a ton of ownership and probably leave the Minnesota passing game a little bit under-owned over here.
Totally. Yeah. Same idea as I mentioned on DraftKings with playing Joe Burrow, or I think Joe Mixon's going to be chalk, but if the touchdowns just go to the passing game, Kirk Cousins could be a strong play, and then you fade Alexander Mattison. So you're sort of, picking up 2 edges there.
Yeah, and Justin Jefferson comes in as our number 4 wide receiver in dollars per point for FanDuel this week. So an attractive guy there who, similarly could be lower. We'll see about how he and Adam Thielen come in. Adam Thielen, by the way, just remains like nature's argument against the idea of TD regression.
Yeah, exactly.
Running back, what do you think for cash?
So Antonio Gibson, I think, is almost a must in cash at $6,200. He had 29 carries and 7 targets last week. And that was with JD McKissick playing most of that game. McKissick looks doubtful for this one with his concussion. And even before that, Gibson had 26 and 19 opportunities in the previous 2 games. So just a great volume bet for this price tag. And the matchup is good too. The Raiders are 30th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs.
Yeah, Gibson's got 3 more carries than anybody else over the past 3 weeks, 14 more carries than anybody else not named Jonathan Taylor. Raiders are number 3 in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. And the past 4 weeks for the Raiders defense has included allowing 100+ total yard games to Devontae Booker, Darrell Williams, and Joe Mixon. So it's tough not to start with Antonio Gibson. It's a pretty loaded week at running back, though. We've got Jonathan Taylor priced all the way up to $10,500. That's territory where we've seen Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, and almost nobody else before now. Are you still trying to fit Jonathan Taylor into cash lineups on FanDuel, or are you going away from him, $9,400 Joe Mixon, or even just like below that?
Yeah, I'm probably not going to get to Jonathan Taylor, and it's more about the quality of the other options than Taylor's spot is obviously awesome, or his price tag. If I'm going expensive, it'd be Alexander Mattison for me, $8,700. I just think he's probably the best touch bet among running backs this week. He had 34 and 32 opportunities in the 2 games that Dalvin Cook missed earlier this season. One of those came against Detroit back in week 5. He had 25 carries in that game for 113 yards, also caught 7 passes for 40 yards and a touchdown. So I think you're going to get 20 to 30 touches in a good matchup for Mattison.
Yeah, and then even below Mattison, we've got Leonard Fournette against the Falcons, James Conner against the Bears, Elijah Mitchell against the Seahawks. All those guys are 1,000 plus cheaper in FanDuel salary than Mattison. We'll see about Darrell Henderson's injury status. If he's out, then we've got Sony Michel at 5,300, just making things even more interesting. That could counterbalance Jonathan Taylor and work alongside him in a cash lineup. And then I haven't even gotten to Jamaal Williams, 6,500, Myles Gaskin, 6,400. Those guys, probably more GPP considerations here.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, we need a fourth running back spot in lineup this week. I want to play all these guys.
That's right. So what are you playing on the tourney side at running back?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to get too funky at running back in tournaments, even just because all those guys are such strong plays. Saquon Barkley is a little tempting to me if you want to get someone low owned. $7,200. He was back to workhorse usage last week, played 87% of the snaps, 13 of 16 running back carries, got 5 targets. If you go back to the beginning of the season, I'm not saying this is going to happen again, but what happened with Barkley coming off the ACL is his first game, he was limited. You know, his snaps were way down from what we usually see. His second game, he got strong usage, but the production wasn't good. And the next 2 games, he went for 18.4 and 27.1 DraftKings points. So if he, follows the same pattern here, first came back from the ankle, he was limited. Last week he got the usage, but not the production. Does the production follow this week? I'm not, confident it's going to happen, but I do think you're going to get Saquon in, single digit ownership at a pretty nice price tag.
You definitely should get him at single digit ownership because there is a lot more to like more at running back this week. So I'm not going to get that adorable, but I can understand the argument for him. I'm not going to get cute here. I'm just going to pull from the players that we already mentioned because it's a deep enough pool. I'll see what the ownership looks like over the weekend, see if anybody's lagging or, who is just at the top of it and pushing me away from using those guys. But there are plenty of guys to love here. Even if I'm getting a couple or 3 that are in double digit ownership projections, I'm going to stick with them. Before we get away from running backs, I want to throw out that the Vikings defense, I was looking up on Pro Football Reference this morning. They are second worst in the league in expected points contributed in run defense, ahead of only the Chargers and way behind the third worst team in the Chiefs. That, of course, is the matchup for Jamaal Williams. It probably gets a little bit tougher because they're getting some defensive tackles back from injury and from the COVID list, but still a very positive matchup for Jamaal Williams. And again, the bigger thing in his favor is that the Lions have thrown and completed more passes than any other team to running backs. And now it's just Jamaal Williams with DeAndre Swift out.
And Detroit actually has a capable running game too. Like the passing game is absolute trash, but the running game is, I'd say, like league average. So it's not like Williams is in a bad spot there.
Yes, I agree with that. Wide receiver for cash. So Jared, I get to wide receiver and I think, why play Jonathan Taylor for $10,500 when you can go to Cooper Kupp at 9,000 and instead load up on running backs in the 7 and 6K ranges? Is that your thinking here, or do you need to look more at Jonathan Taylor? No,
I think you're right. Kupp at 9,000 might just be a better straight up value than JT anyways. Then when you factor in, there's more viable running back plays for cash than there are wide receiver plays. So I'd rather spend up for Cooper Kupp in cash. So I like that call. I want to spend up too for Keenan Allen, who I think is just underpriced for the volume he's been seeing. $7,300. He is 5th among wide receivers in half PPR points in 5 games since the Chargers bye week. And that's despite scoring just once. I mean, we know Keenan Allen's not a big touchdown scorer. I do think he has some positive touchdown regression coming though. And even without the touchdowns, he's still been producing as a top 5 wide receiver. He's second among wide receivers in targets over the past 5 games. He has double-digit targets in all 5 of those. Bengals kind of a neutral matchup for wide receivers, and nothing to worry about there.
And we've seen this from Keenan Allen before, where he goes on a touchdownless streak and we're like, well, he's great, but he doesn't score touchdowns. And he scores in like 4 straight games. So yeah, I agree. Go ahead and chase his usage. Mentioned, Cooper Kupp. You don't really have to make a case for him, but the Jaguars are a better scoring matchup for wide receivers than they are for quarterbacks. Mentioned that they have fared a little better than you might expect. And Cooper Kupp's just, dominated. He's got floor plus ceiling plus matchup here. So easy to like him as a foundation piece this week for cash. On the GPP side, we'll wait and see on the Odell Beckham injury status. He, of course, tied Cooper Kupp with 10 targets last week. I'll be curious to see if we do get an active Odell Beckham, what his ownership projection looks like, because I'm sure if he were fully healthy, we would be getting high ownership from him this week at 6K.
I was doing my Fantasy Pros rankings last night, and his consensus rank as of last night was in like the 30s. Like it was like wide receiver 32 or something. We have him way higher. We'll see about the injury thing, but I don't know. Maybe he's not going to be as popular as, our projections for him would suggest. So we'll see about that. Tournament wide receivers, I like Marquis Brown here, $7,100. His last 4 games, 14 targets, 12 targets, 13 targets, 10 targets. He's been like more of a possession type receiver in the offense this year than this, like lower volume shot play guy. He's second among all wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game over the past 4 weeks. And again, I like this matchup as a bounce back spot for the Ravens offense. The Steelers are 27th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers.
I have Marquise Brown down as well, and I like him as the way to buy, kind of a stake in the Lamar Jackson rebound game, because even if Lamar Jackson doesn't, go all the way to ceiling here, he can just be decent, and Marquise Brown can have a big game. You mentioned the targets, 10 plus in 4 straight games, including 10 last time out against Cleveland in his return from the thigh injury. It kept him out against Chicago, caught 8 balls in that game. And really, Marquise Brown has been both this year. Early this season, he was still a deep average target depth guy. More recently, it's gone shorter, and he's been catching more and shorter passes. So he could be either one in this game, which could match up with what Lamar Jackson does. And this spot against the Steelers, especially without TJ Watt, could be good for getting that deep passing game going again. Give Lamar Jackson a bit more time to set up, to let those deep routes set up and target downfield. The target volume gives Marquise Brown the attractive floor here, where I'm not worried about him burning me. And then that deep ball upside gives the ultimate ceiling. Even if we just get, like a 60-yard touchdown and then 3 to 4 other normal catches, that could be a nice day for a $7,100 receiver.
Totally.
Over to tight end. What do you like for cash?
George Kittle pops as easily our top dollars per point value at tight end. He's $6,300, $1,000 less than Mark Andrews. You have Rob Gronkowski up at $7,000. So Kittle's just underpriced. He's coming off the dud last week, but he had 3 strong games before that: 17.1 FanDuel points, 13.5, and then 11.4. No Deebo Samuel in this game frees up some extra targets for George Kittle, and the matchup's good against Seattle. The Seahawks are 29th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends.
Yeah, he sits well ahead of the rest of the tight ends in our FanDuel dollars per point. So I certainly like him over here, especially where I don't need him to get, 10 to 12 targets to ultimately pay off. He's only $300 more than Mike Gesicki and $100 more than Kyle Pitts this week. Yep. So yeah, the price is just off on what we're getting here, and he's significantly cheaper than Mark Andrews and Rob Gronkowski. So George Kittle certainly the favorite for cash. On the GPP side, even though the ownership's going to run high, I think on Foster Moreau, maybe a little bit less high here than on DK. He's at $5,000. I still think that he's going to be in the mix. And then if the ownership projection does just run higher than I'm anticipating, like we get close to 20%, I can pivot from there to Gerald Everett for $4,900 on FanDuel. Second only to Mark Andrews in targets among tight ends over the past 3 weeks. Has had games of 8 and 9 targets in that span. The matchup looks tougher. They get the 49ers this week. They rank 4th in Football Outsiders tight end coverage DVOA, but 49ers have no Fred Warner, most likely this week because of a hamstring injury. And this is the stat that I tweeted out earlier this week. PFF, according to the PFF numbers, Fred Warner has been targeted on 8.3% of his coverage snaps for the year. His teammate Azeez Al-Shaair, who looks like the number 1 linebacker for the 49ers this week, has been targeted on 17.5%. So that's more than double the targets. They've both played more than 300 coverage snaps. So it's not, a sample size issue for either guy. It looks like an area to target this 49ers defense this week. And the 49ers look like they're probably not going to have Dre Greenlaw or Marcel Harris at linebacker either. So it's going to be a particularly weak spot. And targeting that middle area of the field for Seattle also has the potential of opening up the deep stuff for DK Metcalf, which they desperately need to do just to get that offense going. So it's one of those that you can just kind of look at it and it makes sense for the Seahawks to be using Gerald Everett quite a bit this week.
Yeah, who is DK Metcalf? I haven't even seen that guy in a while now.
I think he used to carry AJ Brown's pads in college.
That's right. Elijah Moore's as well. I agree with you on Foster Moreau. I think he's not gonna be low owned on FanDuel, but he's gonna be way less chalky here. He's not as big a value. So I think Moreau is a better tournament play on FanDuel than he is on DraftKings. It's tough for me to get away from Kittle even in tournaments. I do have some interest in Pat Freiermuth. I mean, he's $900 less than Kittle. Like I'd rather just find the $900 to get up to Kittle, but Freiermuth is a nice play here at $5,400. He has 12 plus FanDuel points in 3 straight games now without Eric Ebron, and Eric Ebron's going to be out for Sunday's game against the Ravens. And the Ravens, we know, tight end coverage is kind of the weakest part of their defense. Football Outsiders has them 17th in tight end coverage, and they are 26th in adjusted points allowed to tight ends.
Jared, I think we'd all like to find an extra $900, but sometimes times get tough and you just have to go down to the next guy.
True.
Defense. I'm starting with the $4,000 Miami as my base defense here. Whether it's Mike Glennon or Daniel Jones, I think we're expecting Mike Glennon, but we'll see if Daniel Jones's neck is ready. Miami's 4th among main slate defenses in FanDuel points per game for the season, 17 plus FanDuel points in 3 of the past 5 games, 10 takeaways, 16 sacks over that span. None of those 4 opponents has scored more than 17 points. 3 of them scored 10 or fewer. So it's a good playing defense and a positive matchup against the Giants.
Yep. And Daniel Jones was ruled out just before we came on. So it is going to be Mike Glennon for the Dolphins. So yeah, that's my starting point as well. If I have some extra money to get up to the Eagles, I'd rather play them, but they are $800 more. So you're probably going to have to be sacrificing something to get up to Philly, but they are a great play. Zach Wilson has just been super giving in both the interception and sack departments in all of his starts this season.
So are you sacrificing George Kittle and playing Pat Freiermuth to get to that defense?
No, I would definitely rather play Kittle plus Dolphins than Eagles plus Freiermuth.
Yeah, there you go. If ownership does run high on the Dolphins because it's a positive spot for a good defense right now, or if there is just extra money lying around, which is always a nice thing, like you put on the winter coat for the first time in a year. The Bucks 4,300 against the Falcons, the Colts 4,500 against the Texans, Eagles, as you mentioned, 4,800 against the Jets. The Bucks delivered 12 FanDuel points last week, even while allowing the Colts to score 21 points in that game. They had 5 takeaways, 3 sacks against Indy, second straight game with 3+ takeaways, third such game among their past 5. So they've been a pretty good fantasy defense lately.
Yeah, lots of good defense options this week. So I would, let ownership kind of guide you as far as your tournament exposures go.
Well, that's going to do it for this Week 13 FanDuel podcast. Head over to DraftSharks.com now. You can get more player recommendations. Kevin English has your cash game picks. Corey Bushland has your top GPP options. And then you can play around with the lineup generator to build your own lineups with the help of the DS projections and FanShare ownership projections. For more of DFS talk or any other format that you might be playing, you can also join the free DraftSharks Discord. You can find the link to do that in the description for this podcast. For Jared Smola and the rest of the Draft Sharks crew, I'm Matt Schaff saying thanks so much for swimming with us.